still have quite a few things to do, but I'll make sure
Yeah,
we get
you're
what we
posting
need
that
to
on
do
double
so that
step.
we
I
can
was
do
like,
the
yeah,
problems
that's
that
totally late.
we do on Sunday.
Nah, I wear maybe like eyeliner, maybe.
Remember-
Right, I feel like it.
Each ion has its own concentration gradient and therefore has its own equilibrium potential. So here are some typical, but not exact, these are typical values, and so these are some typical values for the equilibrium potential for potassium. A large negative number, because it's negative on the inside at equilibrium. If the membrane were permeable to sodium, and only to sodium, remembering that the sodium concentration is high on the outside and low on the inside, the equilibrium potential for sodium would be positive. Because sodium would flow in, more positivity on the inside, to get until it got so positive that it reached equilibrium at this voltage. The equilibrium potential for calcium is a very large positive number, which we'll be using later. And the equilibrium potential for chloride is a variable negative number. You'll be using these numbers and understanding them, hopefully, in the problem, using the problem set. These are typical equilibrium conditions for each of these important ions.
So do you want us to
You don't have to know them by heart. You do have to know that the equilibrium potential for potassium is negative, that the equilibrium potential for calcium is large positive, that the equilibrium potential for sodium is positive, and the equilibrium potential for, well, I'll probably not ask you a question about chloride, but it turns out it's usually negative. You don't have to know the numbers. Don't waste your brain power on memorizing the numbers. Any of these numbers. You don't have to memorize these numbers or these numbers, but they're there. This is a reference slide. Non-equilibrium, where we live, where we are. We have sodium gradients, and we have potassium gradients, and we have chloride gradients, and we have calcium gradients, and we have potassium channels, and sodium channels, and calcium channels, and chloride channels. We are not at equilibrium. And here is an equation that defines the membrane potential as a function of the gradients of the ion, the concentrations of the ions, and their relative permeabilities. This is the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation that you'll be using for the homework. This is the equation that takes these equilibrium conditions, lumps them together, and solves what the membrane potential will be, is, given these concentrations and these permeabilities. So, for example, some of you might be saying, okay, if this is the generically true state, and if let's just say this equation should reduce to the Nernst equation for potassium, the equilibrium potential for potassium, if the membrane is permeable to potassium and only to potassium. Those things have to be true. If this membrane is permeable to potassium and only to potassium, the membrane potential, Bob, you just said, the membrane potential will be equal to the equilibrium potential for potassium. Is this true? Well, it is, because if the membrane is permeable to potassium and only to potassium, this is 0 and this is 0. So they disappear. And if the membrane is permeable to potassium and only to potassium, this is 0 and this is 0. So they disappear. And if this membrane is permeable to potassium and only to potassium, this is all that's left, and these terms cancel. And if you solve this, that's the equilibrium potential for potassium. So this equation reduces to the Nernst equations for each ion under the appropriate conditions. So this equation, this voltage, is the voltage the membrane would have given those concentrations and those permeabilities. Leah.
For the chloride, is it supposed to be in over out
Ah.
or
Good eye. This is correct. The reason why chloride is in over out, and the reason that sodium is out over in, is that chloride is negative, and Z is -1, and Z has disappeared, and it's one of the magic things of logarithms. A negative logarithm, I don't want to do the math. This is correct. The difference is chloride is negative and sodium and potassium are positive, and that's why this is upside down relative to this. Magic of logarithms. I can do it if you want, but Alex.
Is VM the same as MV on the other slide?
Yeah, there's VM, the voltage of the membrane. MV, the membrane voltage. EM is another, the E and V are equivalent here, so EM is the membrane voltage. Don't get confused by this. There's lots of jargon here. This is the voltage that the membrane would have given these concentrations of these ions and these permeabilities of these ions. How do we get permeability biologically? Channels. We're going to assume that the lipid bilayer is impermeable. And if we put in potassium channels, we put in potassium permeability. If we put in sodium channels, we put in sodium permeability. If I put in little holes here in this glass, I do not increase the human permeability, but I do increase the air permeability, because air can flow in and out of this room through little holes, but humans cannot. If I increase the number of doors, I increase the human permeability. Permeability is the window or doors for the flow of the ions. Increasing sodium channels increases sodium permeability. Increasing cation channels increases sodium and potassium permeability, but not chloride permeability. So this is the equation you're going to be working with in the homework. So here is the website that you'll be using to load the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation. If you load that equation, you get a site that looks like this. If you press the Launch Now button, it might give you an error. It might just do this, because I've cleared the error. If it gives you an error, go to the Not Secure button and allow it to run. Okay? And you might have to allow it to play Flash. So I have allowed it, but every time I turn on and off my computer, it resets and it says it just freezes at this page. It doesn't even give me this page. It freezes. Doesn't allow me to do it until I click on allow. I allow it to run. So if you get stuck there, allow it. An alternative is to actually download the program to your machine and run it from your machine, not from the web service. Either way. So if you click on this box, it loads the program. I hate this thing, so I'm going to turn it off. This is the Nernst equation for potassium. If I click on sodium, this is the Nernst equation for sodium. Here's chloride. Here's the Nernst equation for chloride. Okay, so you can play around with the Nernst equations as well. But we're going to be interested in the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation that has the permeabilities and the ions all at the same time. And we're going to work at 37 degrees because that's body temperature. But if you were a squid, we could work at 4 degrees Celsius instead by clicking on Goldman. And then we have control of the temperature. But we're not going to play with that. We're just going to click on Goldman at 37 degrees and not worry about temperature. It comes up with a default condition which is wrong. If you click on generic cell, you come up with something that is closer to correct, but it is still not what you want to use for the homework. For the homework, you want to put in the values on the homework. So for example, I think in the homework, the potassium concentration on the inside is 155. So if you double click on that slider and you put in 155, it gives you the right number. So you can double click on the slider and not have to spend a lot of time, okay, 4.5, yeah, you can play with this, but if you just double click on it, you can get the right value. I don't even know if those are the right values, I'm just playing. This is the concentration of potassium on the outside, this is the concentration of potassium on the inside. Input the correct values to get the correct answers, and make sure you're doing it right. pK, this is the permeability to potassium. This is the permeability to sodium. This is the permeability to chloride. This is the number of potassium channels, sodium channels, chloride channels. So it starts out with, and the absolute value of these numbers doesn't matter. What matters is their relative proportion. So for example, in this condition, the relative permeability to sodium is 5%, 5 over 100, 5%. So actually, this generic condition, I think it might be correct for the homework assignment, for the resting membrane potential. In this case, the resting membrane potential is reported up here at minus 67.7, which is not correct for the homework, because something is wrong. Something in here is wrong compared to the conditions of the homework. So here is where you see the Nernst equations for each of the ions. These are the equilibrium conditions for each of the ions. Here is the equilibrium potential for potassium under these conditions. Here is the equilibrium potential for sodium under these conditions. Here's the equilibrium potential for chloride under these conditions. So here are the Nernst equations, and here is the solution to the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation, given these permeabilities and these concentrations. And your job is to plug in the right numbers and solve the problems, and then explain it very briefly. So for example, if I say the number of sodium channels increases by a factor of 2, okay? I've got 5 sodium channels, let's just say I've got 5 sodium channels. For every 100 potassium channels, I've got 5 sodium channels. I just said I'm going to increase the sodium channels by a factor of 2. Okay, so I would increase sodium by a factor of 2, so I'd increase the permeability to sodium from 5 to 10. And now I have a different membrane potential, and that would be the answer to that question, and you'd have to explain why it went from minus 67 to minus 56. Okay? And then you know, in between the problems, you'll always want to reset to the starting condition just to sort of get back to where we start so that you're not adding changes on top of each other. If you have a question while you're working on the problem, don't hesitate to send me an email and saying, just, I don't get it. I'll be happy to try to explain it. It might mean getting together for me to explain it, or I might be able to do it myself. Please don't assume you have to figure this out on your own. I'm happy to help you. I want you to learn about membrane potentials using this calculator. This is a calculator. That's all it is. If I ask you to change the potassium concentration, you'd say, well, which one? And you'd look at the, oh, change the extracellular potassium concentration. And you change this number. If I ask you to change the chloride permeability, you would change this number. If I ask you to take the membrane potential to another value, you'd have to decide, okay, how do I take this membrane potential to, let's say, I think one of the questions says, at the peak of the membrane, at the peak of the action potential, the membrane potential is not negative 60 something, it's positive something. So how could I get this positive? Well, I could either make the permeability to potassium lower, which doesn't make a lot of sense because I know there's high resting potassium permeability. So I'm going to put this back where it was, and I know I know that you know from cell physiology that at the peak of the action potential, there are more open sodium channels. So instead of changing the potassium permeability, I'm going to change the sodium permeability and make the membrane potential positive. And say, oh, now, okay, let's say I wanted it to go to plus 30 millivolts. Now I have a condition. 500 instead of 5. I've increased the sodium permeability by 100-fold to get to this condition. That's the answer, if that's how you would solve the question of changing the membrane potential. Remembering that cells don't change their ion concentrations, usually. They change their permeability, the number of open channels. 80.
So if you change the membrane potential from like a negative value to a positive value, is that still considered to be depolarization?
Yeah, that would be a very large depolarization.
Even though technically you're going past, you're still polarizing it, but now it's positive.
Polarization is negative in the jargon. This is a polarized membrane potential. This is a depolarized membrane potential. Don't think that positive is polarized. I mean, I can see where you're coming from. Anything not zero is polarized. But in this language, polarized means negative.
Okay.
And depolarized means not as negative as it was before, including positive.
Makes sense.
So, I've showed you how to use the problem, use the calculator. Your challenge is to solve the problems. Asking me questions. So, let's go back to the PowerPoint. See where we are. So I've talked about the Nernst-Goldman-Hodgkin, the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation and the Nernst equation. The language of membrane potentials, depolarizing, repolarizing, hyperpolarizing. I don't use the word overshoot. Anything above zero is called the overshoot, but I don't use that very much. This is from your textbook. And a bunch of clickers. A whole bunch of clickers. Let's skip the clickers. You can do them as homework. We're running out of time. So I'm going to flash through the clickers. I recommend that you use the clickers to reinforce the knowledge that we've gone through in class. Oops. What I want to end with is this. If a member, so this is supposed to be an axon. Here, let's say this is a node of Ranvier. Sodium, let's say during an action potential, sodium has flowed in. That's what caused the action potential to be here. And remember, when ions flow in, they don't just stay where they are. They diffuse, and there's diffusion down the axon. The diffusion is greater, the effect of the diffusion is greater closer to the site, and it dissipates as we move along. So the point is that at the site of a channel, so let's say this is a sodium channel. I know it's sodium because we're talking about, well, it says it, and we're talking about sodium moving in. Sodium moving in makes a large depolarization here that gets less and less and less as we move further and further away from the channel. Okay? So this is going to be a concept that will be important for understanding how action potentials spread, which we'll be talking about on Tuesday. Questions about anything, because I think we're pretty close to done. I do recommend that you use the clickers. I'm happy that will be on Moodle in just a few minutes. I'm happy to answer questions. Problem set, due on Sunday. I'll see about a third of you this evening at 7 p.m.